We're extremely happy, Paul and I, to be able to do a meeting in India as part of the series of meetings that we organize in order to bring together the different stakeholders. This meeting is actually taking place in 2016 in the context of a conference that we will convene in November in Paris, the first global internet and jurisdiction conference. That will be an event of about 200 people, and it's extremely important to have in the preparation for that event a certain number of interactions with actors concerned with those issues around the world. And it was particularly important for us to make sure that the Indian perspective is taken into account fully in the preparation of this meeting because of the importance of India in those topics and on internet governance in general. So we have a one-day meeting that will basically have two different components. The first one will be, for this morning, a panel and a general discussion on the general issue that is written behind me, which is how to make sure that more cooperation is being developed between the different stakeholders to address the challenges of jurisdiction on the internet in order to preserve the global nature of the internet and to make sure that the different legal systems can coexist in fundamentally cross-border infrastructure. This session will be actually, and is recorded on video, and we will post this video afterwards, but the rest of the meeting this afternoon will be an open discussion under Chatham House rule, as the tradition is, in order to facilitate a direct exchange. So, thank you again for having taken the time. Thank you so much for ORF for co-organizing this with us, especially as you have had another event yesterday, so it's a pretty heavy week for you. It's a great pleasure, and without further ado, I will launch this discussion. It's probably not necessary to introduce the panelists to this audience, because I guess that most of you know Samir, Chinmayi, Gulshan and Ankidas. But what we would like to do is to launch the general discussion on this issue of how the jurisdictional challenges on the internet call for cooperation. And so maybe I would like to start with Dr. Gulshan and ask him what is the perspective from the Indian government. You're the national coordinator for cyber issues. How do you perceive this challenge of jurisdiction on the internet from the Indian perspective?
Thank you very much, Vatant, and first of all, I must thank you and ORF for inviting me and giving me opportunity to not only share my views, but also get educated from such a elite class of the participants who are present here. Each one of them is an expert, and I tell you, it becomes, at times I shiver when I come to this forum with an elite class like this, because they look at you from multiple lenses and with all 1,000, 2,000 magnifying amplification factor. Thank you very much. Yeah. And then top of this, you said you are putting a video and it will be published. That becomes a... So one has to, be very careful. Anyway, I'm not a loser. I'm at this age where I have nothing to lose but gain on it. So thank you very much once again. So when I entered this hall, I met Bertrand and we discussed. He was asking me some questions. And suddenly we look at this, he says, internet and jurisdiction. And then the next line is that internet jurisdiction. These two has a different meaning. And I told him I am going to talk only on the aspect, start with the internet and jurisdiction and come to the internet jurisdiction. There is a difference, there is a meaning which he has, I think, is a purposely or it must be a purpose that which he has put these two in a fashion which may or may not attract attention of the such elite participants there. We have internet, and then the issue internet has led to the issues of jurisdiction. That's the one message which comes there. But is it so simple? Is not so simple there. If you look at the internet economy, yesterday there was a panel which was organized by ORF. Madam Lata Reddy also was a co-panelist there. And the other co-panelist was moderated by Mr. N.K. Singh, and Dr. Shashi Tharoor was the other panelist there. For a change, all the panelists was more or less on the uniform consensus, though it started drifting, but then it was a uniform panel, that the internet economy is growing there. And by 2025 or so, India also will have the, by and large, tending towards 100% digital economy, which is slightly almost 38 to 40% today, but will be leading to 100% kind of a thing. May not be 100%, but somewhere 90+%. That digital economy will be there. We'll be playing a lead role in terms of the cyberspace, and we find that in the last 2 years, whenever the Prime Minister went and discussed with any head of the state, he has recorded that everywhere they talk about the cyberspace and everyone talk about cybersecurity. And after coming to my present thing, I find that the request for discussion on the cybersecurity issues have become more than when Madam Lata Reddy was there. Of course, those time also the requests were there, but now every instance everyone wants to have a cybersecurity issue, and rightly so also. India has now a mobile population of more than 1 billion. We have an internet user. We have crossed 400 million users. Next 100 million users will be from this part of the world, and India will contribute a huge, with large share on that kind of internet penetration. But should we look at it alone India in isolation? But we need to look at it India as a part of the globalization, as a part of the globe, and how the globe is going to expand, because there is a lot of travel will be there. You are not changing the internet connection, go one from country to another country. So we have to look at globalization. That's where the internet part is concerned there. There are estimates there that the whole internet users by 2020 we will be crossing 7 billion numbers, and in a planet of 7.3 billion people, we will be almost touching 7 billion internet users. Every nook and corner of the world is wired today with the internet there. Penetration will increase to somewhere around 80%. Internet penetration will come to 80%. The cloud market, which is a major player, which is a major issue when we talk about jurisdiction issues there, this itself will be almost touching $590 billion. That will be the kind of a estimate which we are talking about. The another factor, we talk about mobile device, but then we will be talking about IoT. That will be almost crossing by 2020, 20 billion devices. That is what we are talking about it there. If you look at the data flow, which is important in the entire global aspects, and the issue of jurisdiction becomes issue there, the entire data flow will go up by a factor of almost 50 times. What we are seeing today is over a period of almost 5 years. That's what projections are there. The global economy impact also by 2025 by IT will be somewhere around $18 trillion. That's kind of impact which is going to come. Now we have to see, that's why when I discussed with him, this is the internet aspect there. Now this internet aspect, is it going to give issue of jurisdiction, or there are certain issues which will impact the jurisdiction part of it? The two very striking incidents that happened in the last few days. One was that the Court of Appeal judgment has come in a Microsoft case, where the number of American companies, they joined in the Court of Appeals to Microsoft. The second one which has come, the bill has been introduced in the US regarding the arrangement between the US and UK in respect of exchange of information. I think my panelist, Anki, was telling me that she will be dealing this detail. Now, if you look at these two, the incident, and look at the internet and jurisdiction, I think these two judgments are largely focusing on certain aspects of the legal issue, while the Microsoft judgment, by and large, hinged around the interpretation of a warrant there. What is the meaning of warrant, and where the warrant is to be executed, what is the impact of warrant, and how long, for where or it can go there, considering the extraterritorial jurisdiction. These are the largely, the focus of the judgment is the warrant and the extraterritorial kind of aspects there. So it's a purely legal issues, and when Madam Aki talk about it, we'll learn more on the UK and the US, that arrangement they are going to talk. Is it going to be what the internet which we are looking at it is going to be only the legal issues, we will be left only with the interpretation, the way these two things have come up, or there will be something else? Now with this expansion of internet, many issues will get arise there. There will be technology issues, there will be process issues, there will be legal issues, and there will be whole kind of a thing. Even the business innovation, business models are also changing a lot there. That's where the internet part is there. And how do we move about it? It will give rise a issue mainly of the privacy, which will be one of the major factors when we talk about jurisdiction. Cloud, the technology which is being developed, under development, and partly being introduced also by the Microsoft or by the Google, where they're implementing artificial intelligence and a single app there, unique identity app there, which we are talking about it. Individual may or may not be a proper identity. Identity will be somewhere else. Will that be answerable in the way the jurisdiction answer has been provided in these two judgments, or what will happen? Because technology is going to make things looking different. Will we be interpreting the legal issues purely on the legal term, or the technology will make an impact? That's the issue which is going to come. So there will be a deep technology issues, IoT, Internet of Things there, where the data will be stored, how the data flow will be there, and in terms of globalization, it will be very difficult to imagine how we'll be able to handle the issues of internet and jurisdiction. And that's where I think, sensing that, he said, internet jurisdiction. We need to bring these two aspects together if we have to really address the issues of jurisdiction. We need to take care of the internet and look at the internet and jurisdiction together as a composite, rather than two in silos or two individual, two separate kind of things there. Friends, the issue of privacy, as I said, is one of the major issues. The second issue is going to be the cyber crime issues, where the US and UK kind of things will come up. The third issue is going to be important, is the cyber security issues. Of course, the security issues will lead to the cyber crime issues, and then the privacy is also connected with that. There are many forums worldwide who are discussing these three aspects. There is a forum of cyber convention, European Cyber Convention. There used to be much talk, much discussion, and nowadays I think understanding the complexity of the entire issue, Cyber Convention also have started thinking, do we need to enforce that, or do we need a separate international legal framework to handle that? Privacy issues are being dealt at many forums. Recently, the European Union announced their framework, privacy framework. We have to see how does it evolve there. It is a far more stringent kind of a framework than which is prevalent there, though it is going to come in 2080s there. Then we have to see the privacy shield between the US and European Union, whether privacy shield will remain in the present form, considering the European privacy framework which is going to introduce in 2018. APAC has come, OECD has come, and the various trade forums are discussing, OECD and other trade forums are discussing the issues of privacy. And all these forums, there are no consensus how to deal with this because of the complexity of the subject there. They have a different approach and different opinion in these issues, which are seen very, very clearly. One can see that. And this aspect, again, is the internet, which is how internet is evolving, is handling that. The other issues which comes wonder to me, maybe many of you will be, Sunil or Samir will be able to throw light on that. We are undergoing a transition when we talk about ICANN. We have taken 2 years to decide first initial framework there. That's by and large, a principal issue, what should be the structure of this thing. The real issues will come. Are that structure, today the question comes to me, I have also dealt with little bit, but the question comes to my mind, with this internet which we perceive, everyone is predicting the next 10 years, will that structure of ICANN will be able to address this issue, this internet? And then we have to look at it. So these issues are becoming very, very complex. I don't think it is an issue of a civil society or it's an issue of a government, it's an issue of a businesses. It's an issue for all of us because ultimately we need to dabble with this technology, we need to deal with the technology, and there is no way we have to be out when we are tending towards 100% digital economy. Countries will have to frame policies. The impact of the Microsoft judgment is both ways there. There is a view, it will encourage localization. There is a view, it may encourage localization. Now, if you have to go if one gets into localization, ultimately, if you look at the privacy framework of the EU, at one time when Dr. Bajaj and me used to negotiate with the European Union, and one country was given the status of the adequacy things there. Now there are, I think, almost 10 countries which are given a status of the adequacy protection, security protection, 10 countries are given there. And many countries are negotiating with the European Union to have a arrangement with respect to their privacy framework, and after Brexit, I think UK also is going to have a separate arrangement, how things will take place. It's a complex subject, and the countries will have to look at their investment policies, and there will be a trend to liberalize those policies, if at all, if anyone has any particular conservativeness on their policies there. There will be a pressure on the investment-friendly policies, and I think we will lead to where the mega companies of the world will have to be encouraged to make investment in the respective regions, respective thing. All policies, in my view, I get mind-boggling kind of things when you start thinking how things are happening. Because I little bit understand technology, and I find that it becomes really a challenge to do that. I think at this time I will stop here. I'll give the other panelists things, and we may come back in the second round. But the issues are, do we look at internet and jurisdiction? Your subject I'm stealing and putting it up, or we look at internet jurisdiction there. That's the issue which I think you may have projected it, but I'm only saying that my view will be that we have to look at, there is no other way other than to look internet jurisdiction in a composite, comprehensive manner rather than a separate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gulshan. I couldn't hope for a better start of the discussion. I was mentioning earlier to somebody from Carnegie here that this bringing the words together reminds me of bringing together representative democracy. When you think about it, it's an oxymoron as well. If you really want to have democracy, why do you designate representatives and vice versa? So I think bringing the two words together is important. And in what you said, there is a very important challenge, which is the number of places where discussions are taking place, the number of stakeholders that have to be engaged around the world, and also the number of topics that are actually interconnected. Whether we deal with human rights, with the economic dimension, with the cybersecurity, all this is actually the topics we're discussing are at the sort of crossing between all these different challenges. You mentioned also that it's a responsibility and a challenge for all the different actors, and so it's a very nice segue to Anki, because in addressing this challenge, there is this dynamic and I hope constructive tension between the desire to have a global network that is providing, as it has provided from the onset, global accessibility and scalability for startups and all that sort of things, and at the same time, the challenge of reconciling the diversity of national norms. So, Anki, from your perspective as representing Facebook here as a global company, how do you perceive, I wouldn't say from the other side of the fence, because it's not another part of the table, the challenge of jurisdiction for a company like Facebook, particularly in India?
So first of all, Bertrand, I want to thank you for working with ORF and hosting this meeting over here. I think Dr. Rai laid it out very clearly. These are very important issues. They're highly complex. I think what has been mind-boggling is that the number of forums where the discussion of data jurisdiction is going on. And first of all, I think there is an urgent need to have some kind of a global map where everybody has a single snapshot view in terms of where all these conversations are going on. The reason I want to thank you is that you chose India to pivot for this important discussion, because I think it's very important that for the world to recognize that India needs to have a disproportionate influence and voice when these discussions are happening. And in a lot of these forums, as a country, our voice is not that visible. It could get really better. I know Dr. Rai has been championing this within the government in terms of making sure that there are more active Indian delegations which are participating in a lot of these global meetings, and a lot needs to happen by way of a forward-moving improvement. That said, I think nobody would have thought like about a year to 18 months back, if you look at the text of the US-UK agreement, which has now been referred by has received executive approval by the US government and has now got referred to by the DOJ to the US Congress for a vote, and hopefully things will happen there and it's not deadlocked. I mean, that's my hope. Like with many other people, nobody could have imagined that a stage would come where bilateral instruments of this character would become so important. It is not an accident. If you look at India's trading basket with the United States, is the largest. It's one of the largest trading partner which this country has. And particularly on the tech sector side, it's a very reliable, credible partnership which has existed for years. Mega companies, including many companies sitting around this table, they are led by people of Indian origin. So it's a huge sort of badge of pride for the country as well. That said, I think what is happening, the trend line which we are seeing globally in the emerging on the private sector side, is that there is greater appreciation on part of governments that they need to negotiate at a G2G level. There is a whole lot of surround activity which has already happened in terms of getting the multi-stakeholder caucuses organized at the national and the regional level. but there were existing historic gaps which existed in the ability of the governments to talk to each other in a constructive manner. And I think those barriers are being breached. And again, I would point to two data points really. One is, of course, this long-running discussion which has happened on MLAT reforms, where you, from the multi-stakeholder side, Bertrand, have played a very important role in terms of surfacing those communities into those dialogue. But that has become a critical component of standard bilateral which exists between countries. From an Indian perspective, I think there was a very strong statement which was made in that regard in the Prime Minister Modi and President Obama joint statement on cybersecurity during successive visits which the Prime Minister has had to the United States. Even in the last visit, which happened earlier this year, there were 2 paragraphs which were dedicated to cybersecurity cooperation, and this entire notion of voluntary norms between these 2 countries were recognized at the highest level, at the head of state level. I'm sure you had a lot to do with that in terms of getting those 2 paragraphs inserted in the joint statement. But we're deeply appreciative of all the work which is happening at the G2G level to make sure that there is this real recognition of the need to collaborate instead of being in a state of conflict. And that needs to translate itself in terms of process improvements, in terms of how MLAT readiness is developed in India, and also how responsiveness is developed on the US side to be responding to a certain degree of urgency when these kind of emergency requests are made from the Indian side. That's point number 1. The second thing which I'm seeing is that as part of this multi-stakeholder dialogue, bilateralism in the G2G space is becoming super important. It's becoming crucial. And there is this view that if you are a democracy, which is, has legislations which satisfies boundary conditions in terms of human rights protections, privacy protections, et cetera, there's a need for countries then to start looking at bilateral mechanisms, as a US-UK agreement is an example of that, then to make it easier for in this case, for instance, the agreement conceives of a scheme where the UK government will be able to issue warrants to global internet companies, global platforms, and in certain cases, conditions to, certain requirements being satisfied in terms of human rights protections and privacy conditions, those companies could then voluntarily disclose data to these government requests and sort of satisfy their warrants or the demands which are made on them outside of the MLAT process. And there is a thinking amongst various experts who are working in this area that this may be the beginning of the ECPA reform process, which has been a long-standing demand from around the world and amongst various groups, both within the United States and outside of it. The private sector is kind of caught in a very strange situation because this is a G2G dialogue. We kind of seem to get thrown in between that and basically then have to work from the outside to make sure that the kind of tensions which exist today are reduced so that it becomes conducive for different people to work together. So my big takeaway from looking at the environment as it is developing for the last 18 months to about 2 years roughly is that there is increased momentum and genuine intent, at least talking from the Indian side. The Indo-US collaboration is at a, is at the best point in time under the current administration here in India. And so there's a lot of focus in terms of improving the MLAT reforms process as such. But also I think there is this opportunity which has been revealed through the joint statement by both the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of India, and we have to use that opportunity to make sure that we are replicating some of the instruments which exist, such as the US-UK agreement, and maybe bring that to life in terms of a model framework agreement between India and the United States, and I'm sure Dr. Rai has views on this. We also have to question that what is this moment which we are in, and I think I kind of keep on going back to the 18-month horizon, is that I think governments everywhere and societies and communities everywhere is grappling with this new threat of the ISIS, which we have, right? And I think that has been a forcing function for a lot of discussions in terms of fast-tracking the MLAT reforms and sort of responding to with a sense of urgency in terms of grappling with this new dimension of a threat so that the cyberspace, which has a net positive from a point of view of economic growth, creating jobs, etc., is not jeopardized by a congregation of bad actors. So those are my top thoughts on this.
Thank you, Anki. You're referring to the bilateral, the draft bilateral agreement between the US and the UK that has been, the proposal has been recently sent to Congress. What I find striking, and we'll have the opportunity to discuss that maybe a little bit further, is that it is a bilateral agreement between two countries, two governments, on a very sensitive issue, which is the capacity to access user information in criminal investigations across borders. And fundamentally what it does is to give the responsibility to the companies to decide whether they accept or not accept the requests, which is a very interesting trend in terms of the increased responsibility that is put on companies. And I would make a parallel with the discussions that are evolving in Europe on the right to be de-indexed, where the Supreme Court, the highest court in Europe, has fundamentally given a foreign company, a search engine, in this case Google, the responsibility outside of the Europe to arbitrate between the right to access information and the privacy rules. And this is something we will be able to discuss a little bit further, because this is an important trend that shows once again the interconnectedness between the different actors. Because in order for the companies to be able to get out of the rock and a hard place situation that they've been caught in, and the Microsoft case is a perfect example of a company being caught between abiding with one law and having to violate another one, potentially. In order to get the companies out of this, there needs to be agreement among the countries. And the question is are those agreements going to be bilateral, multilateral? How scalable are they? And we'll discuss that further. But I wanted to highlight this element because it's a very interesting evolution in terms of defining internet jurisdiction precisely, that it's a sort of combination between the territorial jurisdiction and the cross-border jurisdiction of the companies. It's a sort of hybrid that nobody knows exactly how they're going to evolve. Let me move the discussion further maybe to Chinmayi. In your center, you have a particular angle of analysis on both the situation or the cases and the problems that may arise within India regarding jurisdictional issues and the use of foreign tools, but also you're involved in a lot of international discussions and the processes of the multi-stakeholder debates at the international level. How do you see this evolving from your perspective?
Thank you, Bertrand. Thank you to my hosts. It's such a privilege to be on a panel like this. You're right, at CCG, we have for the last few years been taking a very human rights and good governance point of view every time we look at internet debates. This is something that we plan to continue doing because we feel as an independent academic center that it is our responsibility. But one of the things that I'm going to thread through my narrative over here is how we have evolved through our conversations with people like all the people on this panel, to understand that if we want to engage with human rights and good governance in any kind of useful way, we need to understand all the countervailing concerns. So I find, for example, that I have been arguing with Dr. Rai since 2012, and he has always been gracious enough to continue these conversations. And I often have to go back after 1.5 years and say, you were right and I was wrong. And I missed that completely. And so we're trying to be a little proactive about how we address this. CCG will be setting up an entire team on cybersecurity and cybercrime. And we will be looking at violence against women as well from its own point of internal consistency. So to begin, I just want to recap something that everyone at this table is likely to know. This is for the benefit of whoever sees this video later. This is the Indian Intermediary Liability Judgment, Shreya Singhal versus Union of India. Now, although it was the first Supreme Court judgment that dealt with intermediary liability directly, and did actually, I think, an excellent job considering that it is the first ever judgment on this. Shreya Singhal left a lot of blind spots. There are questions that are not answered yet. We have a system that is pretty functional. Notice and takedown was dealt with in a manner in which a court order is necessary, and so there's no notice and takedown happening with impunity, but there are other questions that remain unresolved. So for example, if government blocking of content is taking place, there is a rule that says that all blocking orders are confidential, which is it's a bright line rule that might stand in the way of transparency in the future. So although the Shreya Singhal judgment answered a few important questions, it's good to note that there are other questions that remain, and that there are other cases on intermediary liability, like the Kamlesh Vaswani case and the Sunita Krishnan case, both dealing with child pornography and revenge pornography, among other things, that are before the Supreme Court. And so Indian legal principles on intermediary liability might change. It's good to remember that. We have had this interesting transition where we started in our first year with intermediary liability work, and we were looking at it from a very free speech, what does regulating gatekeepers do to the free flow of speech point of view. And then late last year, we started working on a project on online hate speech with the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Now, through our research on this, our first report, which we will be launching in November, it's a comprehensive report on how Indian law deals with hate speech. And after this, we plan to move into stakeholder consultations. But we have already started with a series of roundtables. Anki has been a part of one at the IGF. And we've been talking to people about the different problems that they see arising in the context of hate speech. It's related to many of the concerns that both Dr. Rai and Anki just mentioned, which is incitement to violence, a question of proximate violence, and what happens when you have global platforms hosting data and governments across the world need access to data or need a platform to block content very quickly. And we have a regime that is designed such that this is going to take time because of the procedural safeguards that are embedded in it. Now, this is where there is a relationship in part with the MLAT process. CCG is also a member of the Global Network Initiative, and so we're lucky enough to have conversations on a regular basis with companies that are struggling, because it's not that anybody wants to permit incitement to violence around the world. Nobody enjoys not being cooperative in this context, but then the trouble is that if you make it too easy to access data or too easy to seek a blocking order, you end up affecting human rights like the right to freedom of speech and the right to privacy. And it is in this context that these jurisdictional issues that both Dr. Rai and Anki have described in such detail have come up. Now, I highlight this to say that even those of us who have been writing about free speech and have been critiquing using gatekeepers to clamp down on speech or using gatekeepers to access data, we are aware that there are countervailing concerns, and that if they are not taken care of, then it leads to other questions like the ones that Bertrand just brought up, which is that slowly what happens is that governments look at intermediaries and say that, well, if you don't take action against this kind of content, we will have to take it for you. You will have countries with power negotiating with each other and entering into bilateral arrangements, which on one hand, as Anki said, might not be a bad thing, because this is a process that can move faster than a multilateral process, but which on the other hand is a huge problem for countries that do not have political power and for people that don't have access to bilateral negotiations. Because the moment we're discussing multilateral treaties that are being negotiated in the context of an international ecosystem that contains human rights treaties, the entire world is watching the process. The trouble is that it is slow and it is cumbersome, and different countries have different values and different readings of what human rights mean. But the good thing is that the citizens of the world get to watch this, and that we treat the citizens of Sudan the same way we treat the citizens of the United Kingdom, the same way in which we treat the citizens of India. And although CCG is based in India and we deal with the Indian constitution and its values, we are concerned about the human rights of citizens across the world, and we feel like that's something that everyone needs to keep in mind. So moving on, I feel, Bertrand, that the big concerns that we're going to have to look at in the future are questions like what happens if the European Union pressures global platforms into releasing a document that says that they will proactively handle extremist content. Now, on one hand, not to ignore that there is a problem and there is a reason that the European Union felt the need to do so, and that the platforms felt the need to cooperate. But on the other hand, it's important to bear in mind that our entire human rights regime has been predicated on the idea that it is states that control information and states that hold power. And once we move that to the gatekeepers, we have no system to deal with gatekeeper transparency and accountability. And I wouldn't blame the gatekeepers in this context, because where do they go to evolve this system? I know that the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression is looking at the question of business and human rights, and this is going to become really important in the years to come, because gatekeepers play a really important role, and the jurisdiction in which gatekeepers are located, the law that governs them, also plays an important role as a result. Like an academic and like a lawyer, I have asked a series of questions to which I have offered no answers. I'm hoping that in the next 2 or 3 years, our work will highlight these answers. I also wanted to mention that we are very conscious of the technological developments that Dr. Rai has very astutely identified. We're not dealing with websites anymore. We're dealing with encrypted messaging services. We are dealing potentially with artificial intelligence, with algorithms, with the Internet of Things. And we have actually reframed our research agenda for the next 2 years to take all of this into account, to think from the point of view of cybercrime and cybersecurity, and to talk to people who have to deal with an incitement to violence situation, or who have to deal with cyber warfare, with ISIS recruiting people online. And I'm hoping that as more people do so, and as more conversations like this take place, that we will slowly come to answers. Before I conclude, I want to thank both of you, Bertrand and Paul. I remember your first session in Delhi took place along with us, and I feel like this conversation that you managed to design, that brings together people who have looked at this from the government, the platform, civil society point of view, is very useful in terms of moving towards answers. Because the questions we're asking this year are different from the questions we were asking 2 years back, and that's progress.
Thank you very much, Chinmayi. And actually, you're almost taking the words out of my mouth regarding the evolution of the discussion. I mean, all of us in this room have participated in interactions internationally and nationally on those issues. And I find it, in a certain way, very encouraging that there is a counterbalancing trend to all the unpleasant aspects that have happened in other environments. There are increasing tensions. That's obvious. People are more and more aware of the challenges of misuse of the internet, the sort of pendulum swing from the global dimension to a renationalization or a fragmentation in order to solve this. But at the same time, as I hope I feel this panel is already exemplifying, there is an element of convergence in the mutual recognition that the interests of the different actors are not necessarily incompatible, and that instead of balancing the interests, it's more about reconciling the different interests and seeing when you can both catch the people who do abuses or fight people who do abuses, and at the same time protect or even enhance human rights, which has been presented too often as a contradiction. Likewise, in the whole debate about multi-stakeholder approach versus multilateral approach, or governments versus the rest of the actors, it's fascinating to see that we're now even considering that a bilateral agreement between governments actually may be a stepping stone in something that is larger, and that it can be accommodating a multi-stakeholder element. So it leads me to go to Samir now for RF. You are facilitating a lot of discussions and debates among the different actors, and also different regions, I mean, among the BRICS, in the subcontinent, and elsewhere. How do you see the evolution of those discussions going? And particularly, on the last point I was mentioning, we're talking about bilateral things. How to make regimes and frameworks scalable? What is the right critical mass and size, or sizes? I don't know.
Can I use your mic?
Yes, of course.
Thanks. No, thank you, Bertrand. Let me just try and respond to you, that being the last person on the panel. I am now distracted with some of the other thoughts that have been put forth. Let me actually, Dr. Gulshan Rai actually put it very nicely. Internet jurisdiction, internet and jurisdiction.
It goes to him only.
That goes to you. So you put it very nicely. Internet and jurisdiction, internet jurisdiction, or, and I think this is the third thing that all of us struggle with, internet as the jurisdiction. And I think we must understand this, that the structure, the technology, and the design embeds within it a certain code or a certain restrictive or enabling framework, which may not be compatible with some of the real life laws, rules and norms that have been designed. So for example, you don't legislate the Bernoulli's principle. You regulate the price of water, you regulate the size of the pipe, you regulate the quantity of usage, may or may not. Again, they are decisions you take as countries, but water has its own certain chemistry and principles of flow, and then you don't legislate that. So I think, are we over-legislating? So the first question is that we need to find the right balance between achieving outcomes versus intervening in the process itself. I think that's the first question all of us are struggling with all over the world. That internet perhaps by itself has a certain jurisdiction, and it's at some point we will have to give up and get used to chaos. And I think we are generally uncomfortable with the random nature of this medium that is not necessarily compatible with lawyers and policymakers. So that's the first thought that we are, let me just put forth 5 trends which I see, and these are just random pickups from what's been happening in the last few years. And I'm sure many people could list many more, but just to provoke a conversation, I think one thing that all of us are coming to terms with, but have not necessarily reached there yet, and in certain parts more than others, we have not got there yet, is the reality that someone mentioned in one of my forums, that the internet and the enabling platform, or the platforms it enables, are horribly public by default. So everything we do, whether it's commerce, whether it's conversation, whether it's public by default and private by design. So we have to make an effort to keep it private, and generally it is public, which basically means we have flipped the common rationale of real life on its head, where a conversation between me and Chinmayi is private by default unless we decide to use this mic and shout it out. But it also means that all of our countries, be it liberal democracies, be it Saudi Arabia or Iran or other closer regimes, all of us are grappling with the fact that when we have public assembly of people, congregation of people, there are rules that are created for those. Be it in India, if you have certain people congregating in a public space, you need police clearance, you need clearance to go above a certain volume, you have to close the loudspeakers by a certain time. There are real world rules which govern assembly of multiple voices, multiple thoughts, multiple people, and in the internet this is default practice. Now how do you start responding to this? And I think many countries are still unable to respond to this public by default characteristic of the internet. And that is why the debates on privacy, human rights, encryption, and ways to make that private space safe comes into question. But I think this challenges the real world notion. Second, we all understand the power of community and the platform and the positive platform that the internet is, but we all also are now beginning to realize that the bad guys are aggregating even better. So the aggregation of deviants or deviants is still something that many of us are unable to cope with. How do you deal with the single schoolboy, that single classroom bully who was 1 out of 40 students? Now he has found 100 million classrooms around the world, and they suddenly are 100 million people. So how do you manage the aggregation of deviants in a platform that is doing so much good? And I think that aggregation of deviance is something that we are trying to legislate, we are trying to regulate, we are trying to respond through policy instruments, but we are yet to find that silver bullet that can manage deviance. And I think that's challenging. Otherwise, policies that might be simpler to enact. So whether it is hate speech, whether it is against women, whether it is against religion, whatever the case may be. So aggregation of deviance is the second trend I think that will challenge any attempt to come to a sensible, rational policy framework. The third, the biggest pickup in the internet, which is the last 5 years, arguably, if you look at the numbers, is coming at a time when there is a general mood to deglobalize. Now, internet is a medium of hyperglobalization. And this hyperglobalization is taking place at a time when the most developed of economies and the least developed of economies are finding new reasons to set new barriers to globalization. And I think this itself is a contest that is playing out. So in many ways, when you talk about the TPP, setting standards of digital integration, it is basically saying that you do trade in my terms. If it benefits me, you come into this game. It's not about human rights. It's not about democracy. It's not about free speech. It's about certain countries setting the rules of trade. In a world where the mood for free globalization is far less than it used to be some years ago. So that is, I think, another trend that must be brought out, that there will be limits to digital integration because the real world is not that keen on integrating at this moment. So do we need to recognize this as we proceed down the road? The fourth, and I think this is the most fundamental jurisdiction issue, and it's not about the US and India. We will get a bilateral deal in time. You know, the fact is a 400 million people user base in India and a 400 million people user base in the US at some point are both going to talk to each other. I think it's inevitable. We will have a strong bilateral treaty. We will have Mr. Gulshan convince his counterpart that I must have access to data if I have a judicial order or if I follow certain processes. Certain terms of conditions will be set and access to data will be available. I have no doubt about that. It might take a year, it might take 3. That's a matter of time. It's inevitable in that sense that big countries with big stakes in the system and stability of the system will come to bilateral arrangements, and that is still the most efficient way to go. So they will be conditioned by multi-stakeholder voices, they will be checked by civil society, and others will feed into the process to make sure violations don't take place of certain fundamental rights, but bilateralism will still define arrangements going forward. But the most important conversation that is taking place in an unorganized way, or rather, no, not unorganized, it's quite organized, but in multiple arenas, sometimes seemingly distracting us from some of the core issues, is the conversation taking place between the constitutions in various countries and the executive. I think that the social contract, as we know between government and citizens, the role of executive versus the role of constitution, these domestic jurisdiction battles are the most critical for the future of the internet. So you saw that section, the IT Act versus Constitution. You saw, like saying, free speech versus what is provided in the Constitution. You saw arrests on Facebook, etc., etc. It's happening everywhere. Turkey shut down WhatsApp. This morning, I was reading a news story that Turkey has shut down WhatsApp because of the end-to-end encryption. They wanted data. WhatsApp says, I don't have data. It's end-to-end encryption. I don't have the data to share to you. Now, this is an interesting battle. It will obviously challenge many governments who believe that... Sorry, Brazil. No. It's Turkey. Turkey.
Brazil got shut down.
Sorry?
Brazil got shut down.
Brazil, so, okay.
Sorry?
No. I'm talking about this morning. I read a news story. Last night. Okay. It was Brazil. I don't know why every excess, civil rights excess, I'm blaming on Turkey these days. I don't know why. Just my bias. So, I think that's the next trend. That the social contract, the way, and this is not about democracies, about any regimes. About any regime, any pro-development regime is struggling with the is grappling with the same issue. The Chinese are struggling, for example. How do they control the nationalist urges within their Chinese Twitter against the South China Sea verdict? People are willing to go to war. Let's beat them. Let's thrash them. There's a whole jingoistic outburst, and the Chinese are trying to control that. Within the Great Wall of China, they are having their own problems. So. That is the next trend that I want to leave with you. Now, you wanted me to share some thoughts on what could be the big questions that we are grappling with. And then you wanted me also to touch on India. Now, I think on India, like all of us have mentioned, this next 5 years are crucial in many ways. I believe in the next 5 years, we could be the digital powerhouse. Certainly among the top 3 or 4 digital economies of the world, and certainly among the top 2, if not the top 3, in terms of the innovation economies of the world, if we can get the startup and the innovation models right. Now, the question for India, therefore, is that how will it balance this huge opportunity of being a digital powerhouse versus the fact that it is still dealing with real world cleavages, security cleavages. There are societies that can be easily, gender issues, race issues, terrorism, and many security concerns. So how will we balance our urge to securitize this system versus the reality of having to open ourselves up to opportunities that exist? And I think what we do in the next 5 to 7 years will decide our future of whether we would have missed the digital bus or whether we would have been sitting in the steering seat of the digital economy for the world in the future. I think that's one question India needs to answer. And I'm quite hopeful that progressively we are going to see India becoming far more liberal in terms of supporting innovation and supporting digital enterprises than rather going the other way or the other route as we did in the past. I think that's one. The second is, I think we need to, India has again a second call to make, that are we looking at regulating based on law and legal outcomes, or are we regulating technology and infrastructure? I think that is very important. You cannot respond to an innovation. Your policy must be made for a desired outcome. So saying that, for example, and let me be provocative, one way could be that my policy is for data localization. That is one option to take, that data localized, because it implicates many things I can access, I can do X, Y, Z. So let me not worry about the outcome part. Let me say that Sunil Ibrahim, CIS, must locate all its data in Bangalore. The second is, I can say no, I'm interested in privacy protection, data protection, and security, and my policy is intended towards those outcomes, irrespective of the kind of infrastructure or kind of technology you use. So I think you have to be infrastructure and technology agnostic when you come to regulation, and I think that's something that India will certainly have to think about as we go ahead. That's the second thing. The third thing is, and in a sense it answers your question directly, for a country like India, I believe our most efficient and optimum route is to work through either bilateral arrangements or plurilateral clubs. So we will have to look at like-minded countries, similarly placed countries, liberal democracies struggling with security and other challenges, and can we find common spaces? Same, and we don't have to look at the regimes, the larger regime complexes of each of these countries. I mean, I'm not interested in how the EU what the EU decides to do with certain countries or certain issues within their geography. I am more interested that if we have a common space, for example, if Deutsche Bank's biggest outsourcing center is Bombay, how do I ensure that any legal conversation there does not implicate this business potential here? So I have to be nifty to understand that. I don't necessarily have to decide the future of banking in Europe. You know, what they decide as encryption within Europe. I'm more interested in how does it implicate me. And those common spaces India will have to navigate bilaterally. So I still think bilateral conversations tempered by civil society thoughts, academic advice, technical feedback seem to be the best option for India. And my last point is, what do you do? And this is a question, commonly thrown at, I'm sure Dr. Gulshan Rai gets this every time, but commonly thrown even at us who transcend multiple platforms. So, when I go to BRICS, track 2, or when I go to a track 2 with the US, or when I go to a track 2 at SCO, or with the European Union, oh, but how can you talk to us when you're talking to SCO? They have a very different regime. This is thrown at us, that how can you be part of BRICS? They have Russia and China, and also be talking a bilateral. So the answer is very simple. We are looking at common spaces. The UNCLOS exists in spite of regimes, right? You have dual taxation avoidance agreements irrespective of regimes and their human rights positions. So the answer is exactly this, that the minute you bring this down from philosophical to tactical, then you start finding responses. And believe you me, once you can get the right tactical fixes on a number of issues, you will create a philosophy of your own around the digital medium. So I think rather than find that universal philosophy of the digital medium, if we can get some tactical fixes in place on a number of key issues, around jurisdiction, be it on B2B, be it on B2G, be it on C2C or C2B. If we can get some of these tactical fixes right, we will eventually find that we would have come up with our own grammar vocabulary of how the internet should be managed. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir. A couple of immediate reactions. One, when you're talking about the tensions that exist within a country on the social contract and so on. Okay. I'm wondering whether this is not actually something that is happening almost everywhere around the world. I mean, those tensions are different in one country or the other. But it can be inequalities, it can be religious, it can be ethnic, it can be whatever. And what you were describing in terms of having this huge increase in accessibility and platforms at a time where the tendencies on the other direction is applicable also to the social tensions in the countries. The internet and the platforms have this sort of dual capacity to both foster connections and foster interactions in a positive way, but also being used to trigger tensions in many respects, and that's one of the challenges. I wanted to add one trend to the one that the few that you mentioned, which is that it's not only that it's public by default, it's transnational by default.
That's right.
And it's a very unnatural situation, because in most cases of the previous media, you had to negotiate for television, for radio, the right to go to another country. And so here the question is, how do you build the structure and the geography, the political geography of cyberspace, not by progressive aggregation of territorial spaces, but by structuring an already spontaneously global and transnational environment. And the final element, and this will be an ongoing discussion, and I want to open the floor to comments, is that you used not exactly this term, but I think the idea was there, is the notion that on a lot of those questions, treating the problems on an issue-by-issue basis with different kinds of stakeholders around the relevant issues is probably a way to avoid having to design a mega arrangement. And likewise, the challenge that we are confronted with is that you may have an arrangement on a bilateral basis, but if it deals, for instance, with the example that you were taking, like you have a major bank in Europe that is actually outsourcing its services to be hosted in the cloud in an Indian provider, it is actually serving users all over the world. And so whatever bilateral arrangement you may have, you need to have something that is scalable so that it can apply to the users of those services. And this is where I was mentioning yesterday for India, moving from a software development country that ships the software that is packaged somewhere else to not only software as a service, but to the cloud services, is bringing jurisdictional challenges of a different magnitude. Let me open not the floor, but the round table to comments on what has been said, or if either Gulshan or Anki or Chinmayi wants to chime in and have additional comments on what has been exchanged, please don't hesitate to comment. Any comment in the room? Yes, Sunil.
And please introduce yourself. My name is Sunil Abraham, and I'm from the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. I had two questions and a quick comment to both Anki and Dr. Rai. The UK-US deal, which substantive law will apply? Will they honor all requests that meet substantive law criterion as per UK jurisdiction? Or will they only honor those requests where there is overlap in substantive law? And then I think Chinmayi spoke about the EU Code of Conduct, and you basically characterized it as a regime of private censorship. From what I understand, all they're doing is asking internet giants to tighten their terms of service and to implement it more effectively. So in any case, under the terms of services of these internet giants, we only get a subset of our constitutional rights. So it sounds like more of the same. So why is it a bad idea? And then just to agree completely with Samir's point that we should regulate based on goals rather than technology. And I think the problem statement which it addresses is that there is a myth that we are constantly told that somehow internet technology is developing at a rapid pace and regulation will always trail the technology. It doesn't have to if the regulation is based on principles that transcends technology. Then you don't have to worry about, you're actually, many of the principles, such as common carrier principle, which is used for network neutrality regulation. We have common carrier law in India since the 1960s. So you don't have to reinvent non-discrimination. We have done it before. So what worked in the world of the roads might also work in the internet age. So thank you.
Lata, do you want to chime in and we can continue? And Kalmesh.
I just wanted to
And
make
introduce
a,
yourself.
yes, I'm Lata Reddy. I'm a fellow at ORF and I wear many other hats, but I'll stick to that for today. I just wanted to give a little clarification on the India-US joint framework, which you mentioned, Anki. What was put out was, in fact, a fact sheet on framework for US-India cyber relationship, which is available both on the MEA website and the White House website. There was mention of it in the joint statement also. I'm sure Gulshan knows all the wheels within wheels that went on behind the scenes. But I think the interesting thing is that the formal document itself is yet to be signed. But this is an intent to sign that document. The document is to be signed within 60 days, and I think the expectation was that it would be signed by the External Affairs Minister on our side. I'm not sure who on the US side. Within 60 days would make it maybe early August. So then that's when it would come into force. I think the important things in those were the question of cooperation between law enforcement agencies, the real-time exchange of information on critical information infrastructure attacks in both countries. And I think these are very concrete things, and they have resulted out of a bilateral dialogue that's been going on for the last 5 years, and which both Gulshan and I were involved in many of them. And I think this is really what Samir said, that we need bilateral agreements as well as plurilateral agreements, because I don't think it's possible to get a universal agreement at this point in time, even on a universally agreed sector, such as maybe humanitarian, prevention of humanitarian attacks or prevention of attacks on nuclear, because you'll always have a hawk who will say, why not? We should be allowed to attack anything we want, So I think this method is what is going to work. The second point I wanted to bring out is just an interesting idea on privacy. We talk a lot about privacy. What has always struck me is that there's a different value and a different standard applied to what constitutes privacy in different countries, different cultures. But we all, whichever country we come from, do accept certain common violations of our privacy through measures of physical security. We accept these checks and balances with no question. For instance, not just by our own governments, by foreign governments, by banks, even by commercial establishments. I'm talking about what happens at airports, what happens when your biometrics are collected for visas, for passports, for ID cards, for entering public spaces, when you're frisked, when your possessions are confiscated. There are raids for tax purposes and for fraud purposes on your homes and offices. I don't see anybody saying that this is a great violation of privacy, so it shouldn't be allowed. But there's such a fierce opposition to violation of privacy online. So my question is there a double standard in demanding total anonymity online, total privacy online? I think it's something we have to think about. Can there be law and order maintained overall if you insist that these standards don't apply online?
That's one of the big challenge in the background of encryption debate, actually. But please, and Kalmesh.
Yeah, I'm Chandrasekhar from Microsoft. First, reacting to Madam Lata Reddy's point, they also say that we are very squeamish about giving our details to the government, but we put everything on our Facebook post and our thing. So they know where I had dinner last night or whom I'm dating, but I don't want to give to my security agencies or to the government anything. Yes. Yeah, so basically, I'd like to chime in with the ideas which were shared by the other panelists. I am not speaking as Microsoft, I'm speaking in my own capacity as well. Observing this space for the last 3 years, I find that there has been substantial progress and substantial improvement in the area of internet and jurisdiction. And the reasons for this are very easy to find. Just as we are talking about bilateral kind of arrangements in order to narrow the differences, we also need to see what are the areas of friction as far as jurisdiction is concerned. So one area of friction was that what was one man's terrorist was another man's freedom fighter. So different nation states could not agree between themselves as to what is the right kind of data, what is the kind of data to be shared, what constitutes free speech, what does not constitute free speech. But over the past few years, these problems are getting obliterated, and broadly everybody is coalescing to the fact about what is right and what is wrong. So crime which is taking place at the speed of light, the response to that and cooperation also needs to be at the speed of light. So where major acts of terrorism have taken place or there have been major terror threats, the cooperation between nation states and between companies and the government, as Mr. Gulshan Rai will bear out, has been extremely fast. So now what remains as areas of conflict? There are few areas like, for example, free speech, human rights, etc., where different countries might have slightly different definitions of what it is all about. Then there could be areas of financial transactions, because there are some countries which are totally dependent on the security of financial transactions, where they may not want to exchange data very freely. So as far as jurisdiction and cooperation is concerned, just as we are having a bilateral kind of approach, we also need to break down the different segments of the data we are seeking and not try to make a common kind of a law which will not work because they will not agree to everything. So if you say that this is a law, but this is meant only for this kind of terrorism, I think things will move really, really fast. As far as the improvements on other fronts is concerned, due to changes in technology, internet is spreading very fast, internet of things, so the challenges are increasing more. But what we see is that the two primary responsibilities of any government are peace and security and job and prosperity. Now, peace and security, job and prosperity, both are getting increasingly dependent on the internet. Now, with cloud technology coming, there are a lot of players who have to operate internationally. And in the interest of trade and in the interest of jobs, prosperity, etc., we are finding governments moving towards an acceptance that data flow will be transnational, then territorial boundaries have to be respected, and this is in order to encourage the creation of a framework where such cloud technology and other such technologies can go ahead. Then my last thought, I will continue later, my last thought is that even in the area of the cloud and the area of data flows across countries, we need to do a deep dive onto the problem itself. We cannot take data as a principle. Suppose you analyze the data, you will find that over 95% of the data is not having any security value. It could be data on traffic violations, data on tiger census, data on forestation, data on garbage dumps and everything. Now, why should this data be treated as sacrosanct and as important as any data? How does it matter to a country whether this kind of data is located in place X or place Y? So that is where I agree with Samir that realpolitik and tactical way of dealing with things is more important than to deal with it as a Uber and a globalized principle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalmesh, and we'll close this round of discussion after this comment. We will resume in the afternoon because I know that Gulshan will have to leave in 5 or 6 minutes. Yes, absolutely. And we would like to have a picture before the lunch with everybody. So, Kalmesh and Samir wants to make.
Good.
And we'll post it on Facebook.
I will not take more than 5 minutes.
Please.
Well, I think it's a very interesting conversation and very strong points made by everybody. So I think ultimately we are basically all focusing on the kind of word order that we are trying to create in the internet. So internet, which was thought to be a space which has natural freedom, has now come to a space where we are now trying to discuss that whether it can be regulated, rather how far it should be regulated. In fact, Chinmayi and all would know, having been law students, the book by Lawrence Lessig is a 1999 celebrated book when World Wide Web was just appearing and Facebook, social media were non-existent. So it makes a very interesting reading that how one could have imagined that the space is emerging. And he talks about regulability as corner principles. And regulability in terms of basically software and hardware code. Whether the code designed by companies is regulating, or the code we move to the legal code and the legal code will govern the world. So that is a tension, that is the basic issue of ultimately it is the code. Today, WhatsApp has an encryption policy which is end-to-end. Everybody is trying to do that. Google has done it in various areas. So end-to-end encryption, simply because technology makes it possible, is what should run in the world. So that is the question basic in terms of code which will govern the world. Whether the code, the way cyberspace is designed by certain companies will decide the ultimate, or the global cooperation in terms of the governments will decide on how the globe should run. So I think this is the basic issue. We are trying to create a world order, and technology is at the root of all this. Technology development, I mean, no matter what Sunil says that regulations can be as fast as technology, but which is certainly not the case. Because technologies will go on, innovation, startups and so on will continue to happen. And they will run a course up to a certain time till the regulators and the government decide. And as Anki also earlier mentioned, that the private sector has a lot of code, a lot of things which they have decided, are created. And the data is also floating around both by the private companies as well as among the government organizations. So there's a basic change in the world order that we are trying to create, the kind which we have never seen. And I'm amazed more and more. I have recently read only Lessig's book. I had known of it, but I tried 4 years ago. I found it very tough at that time, but I can understand and appreciate much better now. So I think the kind of future which you could imagine and the focus on regulability and code is extremely important. And all of these issues that we are trying to transpose from the physical world into the cyber is probably not possible. At the same time, the cyberspace has interfaced with the physical world. So that is something we have to understand. And that is why we keep talking about human rights security issues, whether cyber or other existing I would say like banks, government and other data which is being held by organizations. So all of those things, how do we actually bring it to the fore in terms of the jurisdiction issues? So this tension is a good one, but whether we can make good out of it in terms of deciding on the code, and the code is something which will have to be agreed upon, whether bilaterally or at a transnational level or plurilateral way, the direction will have to be taken in that sense that we do work together on this.
As a matter of fact, to pick very, very briefly on this, you know that the famous sentence from Lessig is code is law.
Code is law.
There is a way to also look at it and flip it and say law embedded in code. And so this is probably one of the most fundamental reasons why the multi-stakeholder approach, whatever we name it, needs to take place.
Yes.
Because today, there's no way you can legislate without making sure that the technology allows the implementation, the modification, and even the enforcement sometimes. I take a very concrete example, which is geo-IP filtering, for instance. The filtering by IP addresses is a technical choice for implementing a certain type of respective jurisdiction, for instance. Whether it's the right choice or not is another issue. But if you want to implement it, you need it to be embedded in the code. So that was just a side comment. We will be able to continue the discussion this afternoon on two of the questions that Sunil has asked, because we will have one session on the question of access to user data and another one on the question of content. Samir, you wanted to make a quick
points.
comment?
Two quick points. The first is, I think, any multi-stakeholder process, any GGE process, any process of the commission that you were in, ma'am, the Global Internet Commission, are basically trying to discover the 10 commandments of the internet, right? What we are trying to do basically is and this is what Sunil was suggesting. So I don't think you both are saying anything different. What Sunil is suggesting is that so for me, my Bible is Isaac Asimov's writing, right? So if any of you have read his work, and he says 3 laws of robotics, that thou shalt not kill a man. Now that becomes a conditioning law. So irrespective of what your technology should be, it should conform to that basic principle. I think that's what Sunil was saying, that if we say that these are the 10 desirable outcomes, or these 10 boundary conditions around which we need to organize innovation, that is how it will be. Now at some point, those 10 commandments will have to be a living document, and they will also need to change as society evolves, as innovation evolves, as consumption evolves. So you can't have a rigid 10 commandments, but we are looking at a flexible 10 commandments to manage maybe a decade of innovation. I don't think the time frame that we have is going to be lasting 2,000 years as a Bible did, or 1,400 years as Quran did. But we need to create some form of, and that's the norm-making process in a very crude way. The second point, I think I missed a trend, and it's very important. And this is what concerns policymakers at the wrong end of the stick. We have this huge global urge, and I think we have signed on to it. If I remember the framework agreement, or at least the sentiment behind it, there is a certain agreement that free flow of information and data is biblical in a sense for the digital societies, right? Now, what is interesting is, and this is what is challenging policymaking again, that when we talk about free flow of information and data, it is normally in one direction. The reverse is not true. And I think that is challenging governments. So why? Because the real value, and I'm saying this again, the app communities, the innovation communities create value out of data. And what is happening right now is that there is no way of retrieving value from the data once it has flowed out of your boundaries. And I think that is the question. So security is of course an implication, that I want to access my own data that is stored in the servers in the west coast of America. That is one issue. But I think the bigger issue is at some point going to be that are we getting fair value out of all the user information that you have taken to create multiple companies of billions of dollars of wealth, and is that flowing back? And I think that is also one of the tensions today that we need to think about.
Actually, this notion of 10 commandments for cyberspace at the level of principles goes with the definition of internet governance that is supposed to design principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and so on, and defining what are the principles. I want to contribute one that we've seen emerge very strongly in all of the discussion, and is actually connected to the Microsoft case that Gulshan was mentioning, is that in exercising sovereignty in cyberspace, governments need to exercise it in a responsible manner, taking into account the cross-border impact of their national decisions. This is something that is emerging now very, very strongly, because whenever a country has the capacity to exercise very legitimately its national laws on its own operators, if it has a cross-border impact on the citizens in another country, it's an extraterritorial extension of sovereignty, which is in itself a challenge to the principle of sovereignty.